Have you ever thought this?
Tonight we could have a nice steak with
Oh, love some steak. Wait, what if a puncher? Or maybe at least once you thought about the most classical one. Wow, so beautiful from here. That's pretty tall, isn't it? Let me take a look. Somebody could easily die falling from here. Oh my god, what if I jump? Now, if you ever had thoughts of this kind, or maybe even on more outrageous and scary topics, well, you're not dangerous, not broken, nor sick. You're actually human. These are called intrusive thoughts, and studies show, and here's the actual crazy part, that up to 93% of the people have these thoughts from time to time. And if you're curious about understanding these thoughts, what they are, who has them, and why only some people struggle with them, as well as a tiny explanation of what we can do to start healing, well, stick with me, because I'm gonna give you a nice, science-based and personal-based explanation of what intrusive thoughts are. Alright, let's start by defining intrusive thoughts. Now, when I was reading the literature, I was noticing that there's no single agreed upon definition, and instead of trying to find the perfect wording and perfect sentences, I believe it's more important to focus on the components. Now, reading the literature and thinking about these thoughts that I had myself, I've identified 4 key components of intrusive thoughts. The first one being that they are unwanted. See, people don't really think of this stuff consciously, and if it comes up, well, it's not really something pleasant and agreeable to have. The second thing is that they can, not necessarily, but they can get very repetitive, especially if we're talking about clinical populations like people with obsessive compulsive disorder or maybe PTSD. Third, and here's the juicy part, these thoughts cannot only manifest as thoughts like that voice you hear in your head, they actually can manifest as an image or even a sensation. Now let's take the example of a contamination thought. Somebody, maybe with obsessive compulsive disorder, might have this thought that if they don't wash their hands, they'll end up infecting themselves or infecting someone else and killing them. Now, they could be thinking this in their mind as that voice that normally speaks to us, but maybe they could also have an image and picture themselves dying in the hospital. Usually, they can be very detailed and explicit pictures. They might even feel sensations tied to these thoughts. For instance, they might be feeling a weird sense of disgust and their intestine may be shaking. And this is very important to understand because, again, intrusive thoughts can have different forms and can really bother people in different ways. And finally, the fourth component is that these thoughts are usually ego dystonic. Don't worry about this fancy word, it just means that they are the opposite of what people want, which is why they scare some of us so bad, because they are exactly what we will never do, what we fear the most. You can almost see them as the opposite reflection of your values. And at last, I just want you to list some of the incredibly rich topics that these thoughts can target. Some of the most famous ones are indeed the harm-related intrusive thoughts, where people might be thinking, well, what if I punch somebody? What if I want to kill somebody? And all sorts of incredibly detailed variations of that. Another very famous category is the sexual-related intrusive thoughts. Here somebody might be struggling and worrying if they are maybe pedophilic, or if they want to cheat on their partner and spend hours ruminating on these thoughts when they actually don't want any of that. Some other thoughts, as we spoke about before, might relate to the development of disease and contamination. And another big area is the moral religious intrusive thoughts, where people might be having these sort of moral internal struggles. What if I manipulated someone I didn't want to? What if I lied to somebody? What if God is angry at me because I thought this? Now, these are just some of the many topics that intrusive thoughts can attach themselves to. And so who gets these crazy intrusive thoughts? Well, as I was mentioning to you before, it's actually pretty normal, if not absolutely common, to have these thoughts. In a big survey that spanned across 13 countries and that involved more than 777 students, more than 93% of the participants reported having some form of intrusive thoughts from time to time. And many other studies show similar percentages in the general population. Now, what's fun is that probably even more people have intrusive thoughts, even those 5-10% actually have them, but maybe due to factors like shame, they don't really report so in the questionnaires. Either way, the thing is that most people have these thoughts, yet only some struggle with them. And then who? The question is, who struggles with intrusive thoughts? Now, they are common across different disorders, like OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, which affects up to 1 to 3% of the population. They're also a core part of PTSD, depression, and even ADHD. So they can be seen as really a common transdiagnostic factor that contributes to many psychopathologies. Now that we have seen what intrusive thoughts are, who has them, and who struggles with them, I really want to look at the mechanisms that create this suffering for so many people. Why is it that intrusive thoughts can bother people so much? It's very important to understand that depending on the disorder, intrusive thoughts might behave differently. For instance, in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they might remind the person of the traumatic memory they lived. In depression, they might take the form of negative, repetitive thoughts about oneself, which can constantly remind the person of how miserable, seemingly hopeless the condition is. But for the sake of this video, I really want to focus on OCD. In this disorder, intrusive thoughts are so fundamental. They give so much anxiety to people suffering from OCD, which pushes them to regulate these emotions, regulate this fear, through all these behaviors which we call compulsions. Fortunately, there's a lot of research about these mechanisms. A brilliant researcher named Salkowski theorized that the reason why people with OCD struggle is not because they have the thought. In fact, we have seen it's pretty normal to have them, and not everybody has OCD. The reason is because of how they appraise them. It's the interpretation and the meaning that people give to these thoughts that creates and maintains OCD. And Salkowski went further to specify exactly which are the two interpretations that keep people with OCD stuck. The first one being responsibility. Now, responsibility means that somebody with OCD might think that they are responsible for the negative and harmful consequences of the thought. For instance, if somebody is thinking and struggling with the thought about killing someone, then they will think that they are somehow dangerous to others and dangerous to themselves, and that they must do something to prevent this from happening. But where does this sense of responsibility come from? Well, it is not part of the model, but I read this in a fantastic book called Overcoming Unwanted Intrusive Thoughts, in which the authors, two fantastic psychologists, explain which are some of the common myths that keep people stuck with these thoughts. And I see how they relate exactly to responsibility. For instance, the belief that thoughts are under your control. Now, if you believe that every thought is in fact under your control, you're screwed. We think more than 6,000 thoughts per day. How come we are responsible for all these thoughts? Most of them are just random noise that our brains just throws out. Another myth that contributes to responsibility is the idea that thoughts somehow indicate your inner self or that they speak about your character. Now, this is absurd because again, most of the thoughts we have are just the result of random associations. They do not mean nothing about us. In fact, what defines someone's character, it's their actions, not their thoughts. Finally, the most juicy myth, believing that thinking something makes it likely to happen. Now, this is also called thought-action fusion, and is one of the most debilitating appraisals and myths we can believe in. Of course, we cannot change outcomes in the real world just by thinking. You can think that tomorrow won't rain, but you cannot control that, and you won't change any probability of that outcome occurring. However, by holding this myth, we will feel responsible whenever a thought occurs. We will feel like we're actually in danger or we might endanger someone. Now, as a consequence of this feeling of responsibility, the thought is no longer just a normal intrusive thought, it's actually a moral threat. It's dangerous and we're responsible for preventing it. Here's where the second factor proposed by Salkowski kicks in. If people feel responsible for their thoughts, they will also feel like they need to control them. They want to prevent these horrible consequences from happening. And this will push people with OCD to engage in a whole range of compulsions or strategies to regulate these thoughts. For instance, they may try to suppress it. They might try to replace it with a positive thought, or they might just try to not think about it. Here's the twist. There's no such thing as asking your brain to not think about something. For instance, if I ask you to not think about a white polar bear, actually do it. Even if you succeeded, studies show that this thought is likely to come back and come back even stronger. This is called rebound effect. So all these strategies aimed at not thinking about the thought just don't work. But it does not end up here. The need of control these thoughts might also spill out in behaviors. Here is where we find the classical compulsions of OCD. For instance, at the thought of contamination, people might wash their hands until they bleed. They may also seek reassurance from people close to them so that they can feel better about these thoughts. They may also engage in checking behaviors like looking if the stove is off or if the car is closed 15 times, even more. It's terrible. It's incredibly exhausting. I know it myself. I spent hours engaging in my compulsions. And it's also why OCD is one of the most debilitating diseases of all, according to the World Health Organization. But what you really need to understand about OCD is that these strategies to control these thoughts, let them be mental or observable, actually work. And that's the problem. Because they work, they will give a short-term relief to the OCD sufferers, which will then reinforce the idea that the same thought is actually dangerous and scary. For instance, in the contamination example of before, washing hands might make the person believe that they are safe from illness, that they killed all the germs. So their anxiety decreases, but this same behavior signals the brain that in fact that thought was dangerous and that we need this compulsion to feel better. This will create the endless loop of OCD, where the compulsions are not actually regulating and calming down people, they're actually reinforcing the whole cycle. The thoughts will come up more, the people will feel more anxious, and they will engage in more compulsions. That's the OCD cycle, but thankfully, there is hope. There is hope to heal from intrusive thoughts. There's tons of research available that clearly shows that there are a lot of treatment options that can be very effective. For instance, cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure response prevention are some of the standards we use to treat OCD and intrusive thoughts. It's important to acknowledge that treatment often does not involve eliminating these thoughts, but rather correcting these interpretations we talked about, regulating as well the compulsions associated with them. This is what gets people to heal. If we want to take a stoic perspective, it's not the stimuli that bothers us, it's our reaction, it's our interpretation of it. And as I know in my personal experience, I've suffered tremendously from these thoughts. And with time, I've been able to regulate and understand how my reactions, how my compulsions were keeping me stuck. And I can promise you that with hard work, patience, and especially great resources, such as good treatments or even good books, if you're struggling, you really have to read this one. We can heal. Don't lose hope. Thank you for your interest in intrusive thoughts and on thoughts. For me is everything, and I'll see you to the next one. Thank you.